Hello. I think it's very important that we talk about sleep, perchance to talk about dreaming, because dreaming is essential. These days, you may have read, may have watched videos about how difficult people are finding it to get a good night's sleep. It may be you. They can't get to sleep, they can't stay asleep. When they awaken, they're exhausted, as if they hadn't slept, and so on. So what's going on and why is it important? Well, it's a very broad area. What I wanted to focus on was one particular thing, which was REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, dreaming. And although there are other parts of sleep, particularly slow wave sleep, where we have, I guess, the deepest sleep and cellular recovery can take place, REM sleep is absolutely fascinating. We still don't fully understand it at all. It seems to be connected to memory consolidation. And yet, there are other things going on, particularly in relation to emotions. And that's what I want to talk about here. So to begin, and to keep this particular video relatively short, I'll focus on REM and cortisol. Now, cortisol, you probably heard of. Cortisol, one of the so-called stress hormones. It's not the only function that it has, but cortisol typically is monitored by the hypothalamus and the pituitary, released by the adrenal glands, and a negative feedback loop allows this HP of the HPA axis to monitor those levels and increase or reduce as seen fit. That can go out of control. In other words, cortisol is around for too long and often at elevated levels, and that can do all sorts of things like increase inflammation. And cortisol is one of the things that we really don't want around when we're trying to sleep. But cortisol increases during the period of time, let's say 8 hours, as we head towards wakening up. And cortisol can stop us if it is there in too high a quantity, can stop us from sleeping or can stop us from getting as deep a sleep, and also can hinder, if not stop, REM sleep. And over the course of that 8-hour period, as I'll call it, as an average, that's probably what we should get, but a lot of us aren't. During that period, then REM sleep increases. For the first half of that period, slow wave sleep is predominant with some REM sleep. And as we go on, then REM sleep increases and slow wave sleep decreases. So if you imagine that if cortisol is rising anyway, but it's rising, let's say, in too high a quantity, and perhaps too quickly, then that REM sleep can become disrupted. And that's a problem for many of us. Because apart from memory consolidation, one of the things that the REM sleep, it is suggested, does or is responsible for is dealing with emotions. And it's as if the emotions were allowed to de-arouse, those emotions that have built up during the day. And maybe we don't have to de-arouse much, but sometimes if we're stressed, then we do. And if you imagine that at the end of a stressful day or days, then we have to do something with those emotions, and REM is connected to dissipating those emotions. One theory is that our dreams tend to be weird and wonderful because they're metaphoric, and using those metaphors allows us to work through those emotions and allows them to simply evaporate. Now, again, there are other theories about how that mechanism actually works, but consider that if you haven't had a good night's sleep for a day, 2 days, a few days, then what is your emotional state like? You know, very often we'll tend to walk into situations that are stressful, but a lot of it goes over our head. I like to think about that as like a piece of string that is tied to some tin cans. And those tin cans will be yanked off a shelf or shelves on each side of us with a huge clatter if we pull on that string. But we walk under it, it doesn't bother us. But on those days when we haven't slept well, and particularly so if there's a lot going on, then that string is just above ground level. As we walk along, we pull it and all the tin cans come down and there's this huge clatter. And it's upsetting to us. And I think that is a reasonable metaphor for what can happen when we haven't had those nights' sleep, particularly connected to REM and enough emotional de-arousal. In other words, our emotional state is heightened. We're perhaps ready to snap at people more readily or become overly emotional when probably there's no reason to. So if that's the case, if cortisol increases and REM increases and the two of them can clash and normally cortisol will win, then hopefully you can see that we could wake up certainly emotionally tired or perhaps emotionally sensitive. And maybe there will be some memory challenges in there as well. Recovery, slow wave sleep may have been interrupted also, which means that a lot of the replenishment and sometimes that's to do with energy for our neocortex in particular, that hasn't happened. So we can be sluggish, and our ability to orientate in the environment when events happen, we're less sharp. We're not picking up on it. So there's all sorts of reasons that we need to have, should have, must have a good night's sleep. But as I said, I'm focusing on REM for the moment. So if that is the case, and if it is to do with not only memory consolidation, but emotional consolidation and allowing those emotions to dissipate, then how can we help ourselves? Well, I think that, you've probably heard of this idea of looking at screens and blue lights. I suspect that more the issue than that is what we're looking at. If something is emotionally arousing, it's frightening, it's scary, and we're not getting rid of that emotion, then it's loaded up for us to do something with at night time. And that's why it's often useful to have some exercise, not too close to going to sleep, and perhaps not too vigorous. It's also useful often for many of us to avoid alcohol and a big meal or whatever, because all of that can disrupt. And when we get up, it's also useful to get ourselves into daylight if we can, and into some exercise to dissipate what may have been going on, any vestiges of emotions that are still lying around before we get on with the day. But the issue really becomes quite chronic when we're not doing that and we're loading ourselves full of stressful information, images from these mobile devices or the laptop or whatever, and we're not, and then we're stressed and cortisol can increase. And oh, by the way, because things can also go wrong in our own lives, and of course do, then those stressors are threats. And the cortisol level in the first instance, irrespective of the extra loading we put on from the internet and screens and sometimes dramas as we're leading up to trying to get some sleep, that's already there. That stress level is increased because we have these threats around us, and so cortisol may be increased. And hopefully you can see that if we don't get a good night's sleep, including REM, then we might not dissipate all that cortisol, and that set point that I mentioned from that HPA axis can get stuck at a higher level, and it just becomes a vicious circle or a spiral, which is not good. So it is to do with sleep hygiene. Quick tips, as a couple I've already covered. Light exercise, experimentation is probably best to find out what works for you. Alcohol, not a lot or a little, and trying to do things in the morning to reset the body clock, and also dealing with things. Dealing with things before we take them to bed and into our dreams. Dealing with those emotions. Now, some practices in therapy, and sometimes this is connected to trauma, they're trying to get the limbic and other parts of the brain, including, and you've no doubt heard of it, the amygdala or amygdalae, to connect to the more logical parts of our brain and the neocortex, to put things into context. And that is really useful, and by talking things through, and this is when you're awake, with people, going for a walk, accessing a trusted colleague or friend, and allowing those things to diminish, that means that we don't take them into REM with us. And also doing things like gardening, where you're physically doing something. And often when you're doing that, you think, but gradually those thoughts subside. So the memory, the charge, as it were, of whatever it is that has those strong emotions attached to it, like steam from a kettle, it dissipates. So again, once more, those things about getting outside, doing something physical, working in nature if you possibly can, gardening, getting into that state of flow, they all help during the day, so we're not carrying that baggage of those strong but unprocessed emotions with us into sleep. There's always going to be something, because we always dream, or tend to, or most people have fairly regular periods when they do dream, and if we don't get enough REM, then it really is very dangerous for us. Sleep overall, but in particular, quite quickly, REM catches up with us. And that's not the only thing that's going on in terms of sleep, as I've suggested, or indeed REM. But I do urge you to find ways to get a good night's sleep and to deal with things, either by talking them through or doing something which allows those emotions to dissipate as soon as you can. Tackle things up front, if possible. I know the temptation is to run and hide and hope it will go away. I've done that myself, but it doesn't. It tends to just exacerbate things. So deal with it up front.